There are places where history goes to die, where the frozen earth swallows truths too dangerous to speak, where the wind still carries whispers of names that were deliberately erased. This is the story of the Russian ghosts of war, the men and women who vanished into a system designed to make them disappear, and the decades of silence that followed. In the winter of 1945, as the world celebrated victory, another kind of war was just beginning, a war against memory itself. Imagine a landscape stretched across 11 time zones, from the Baltic forests to the frozen wastes of Kolyma, a vast archipelago of suffering that most people never knew existed or chose to forget. These were the Soviet prisoner camps, the gulags, the filtration centers, the transit prisons where identities were stripped away like layers of winter clothing, until nothing remained but a number, a file, a ghost. But this story begins earlier, long before the final shots of World War II were fired. In 1939, when Stalin signed his pact with Hitler, the machinery was already in place, a system perfected through years of purges and political terror, now ready to process a new category of prisoner, enemies from without, not just within. When the war came, the camps swelled with Polish officers, Baltic intellectuals, Ukrainian partisans, entire populations deemed unreliable, transported in cattle cars to places whose names would never appear on any map. Caden Forest, 1940, where 22,000 Polish officers were executed, shot in the back of the head, buried in mass graves, their deaths blamed on the Germans for decades, a lie maintained by governments that knew the truth but chose silence over justice. This was not just murder, it was the erasure of witness, the elimination of men who had seen too much, who knew too much, who might one day tell what really happened in the chaos of 1939. But Katyn was only the beginning. As German forces pushed deep into Soviet territory, millions of Red Army soldiers were captured, and when the tide turned, when Soviet forces began their relentless march westward, millions of German soldiers found themselves behind Russian wire. What happened to them remains one of the war's most carefully guarded secrets. Official Soviet records claimed humane treatment, compliance with international law, proper care for prisoners of war, but the documents that survive tell a different story, a story written in the margins, in the numbers that don't quite add up, in the files that were destroyed just before archives were opened. Stalingrad, where 90,000 German soldiers surrendered in February 1943, fewer than 6,000 would ever see home again. The rest vanished into camps scattered across the Soviet Union, worked to death building railroads, mining coal, constructing the infrastructure of the empire that had defeated them. But here's where the story becomes even darker, even more complex. When Soviet soldiers who had been captured by the Germans were finally liberated, they didn't return home as heroes, they returned as suspects. Stalin's Order No. 270, issued in 1941, declared that any soldier who surrendered was a traitor to the motherland, and in 1945, as Allied forces freed Soviet prisoners from German camps, they were immediately transported to Soviet filtration camps, interrogated, accused, punished for the crime of survival. Imagine, you fight for 4 years, you survive the hell of a German PO camp, you dream of home, and when liberation finally comes, you're arrested by your own army, branded a traitor, sent to a gulag in Siberia, where you might spend the next 10 years in conditions as brutal as anything the Germans inflicted. This was the fate of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, men who had suffered unimaginable hardship, only to discover that their own government considered them contaminated, dangerous, potentially disloyal because they had seen how the West lived. And it wasn't just soldiers. Forced laborers, the Osterbeater, who had been shipped to Germany to work in factories, they too faced filtration, interrogation, exile, because they had breathed foreign air, because they might carry ideas back with them, ideas about freedom, about systems that didn't require secret police to function. The logic was brutal but simple. Anyone who had seen beyond the border was a security risk, and in Stalin's Soviet Union, security risks disappeared. The camps themselves were studies in calculated degradation. Wooden barracks that offered no protection from -40-degree winters, rations calculated to keep prisoners just barely alive, just strong enough to work but too weak to resist. 12-hour shifts in mines and forests, where frostbite was routine, where losing a finger or a toe was almost expected. Medical care was non-existent, or worse than non-existent. Camp doctors who saw prisoners as experimental subjects, who documented the effects of starvation with clinical detachment, who understood that their job was not to heal but to maintain productivity for as long as possible. But perhaps the cruelest aspect was the bureaucracy, the meticulous record-keeping that documented every arrival, every transfer, every death. And then, after Stalin died in 1953, the systematic destruction of those same records. Files were burned, ledgers were redacted, entire camps were erased from official maps. Guard towers were dismantled, mass graves were covered with concrete or simply forgotten. Why? Because the camps held not just German prisoners, but Allied prisoners too, British soldiers who had been captured by the Germans and then liberated by Soviet forces, only to vanish into the Gulag system, their fate unknown to their families for decades. American pilots shot down over Eastern Europe, who parachuted into Soviet-controlled territory and were never seen again. French resistance fighters, Polish Home Army soldiers, anyone who might testify to Soviet war crimes, anyone whose survival was inconvenient to the official narrative being constructed in Moscow. And the narrative being constructed was very specific. The Soviet Union as victim and liberator, never as perpetrator, never as a power that used the chaos of war to settle old scores and eliminate future threats. When prisoners were finally released, those few who survived, they returned to a society that didn't want to hear their stories. Survivors of German camps couldn't speak about Soviet filtration, couldn't mention the interrogations, the accusations, the years in Siberia, because to admit you'd been in a Soviet camp was to admit you'd been labeled a traitor, and that label could still destroy you, could still cost you your job, your apartment, your children's future. German prisoners who returned in the 1950s, gaunt and broken, found a West Germany eager to rebuild, eager to move forward, unwilling to dwell on the suffering of soldiers who had fought for the Nazi regime, their stories dismissed as propaganda, exaggerated, unreliable. And so the silence deepened, became institutional, became the official policy of nations that had reasons to forget. The Western Allies, who had agreed at Yalta to forced repatriation, who had sent Soviet citizens back to certain death, preferred not to examine that decision too closely. The Soviet Union, which had committed atrocities that rivaled those of the Nazis in some regions, found it easier to maintain the myth of righteous struggle than to confront the complexity of what had actually happened. And Germany, divided and occupied, was in no position to demand accounting for its missing soldiers. Only in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, did some of the archives open, and even then, selectively, grudgingly, with entire sections remaining classified or lost. Researchers who tried to piece together the story found gaps, inconsistencies, documents that contradicted official histories, mass graves discovered by construction crews, marked only with numbers, if marked at all. In Kolyma, the coldest inhabited place on Earth, where prisoners mined gold in temperatures that could kill in minutes, archaeologists found campsites where nothing had been recorded, where thousands had died, and no one had bothered to count. In Kazakhstan, in Siberia, in the forests of the Baltic states, the evidence emerged slowly, reluctantly, like secrets the Earth itself was tired of keeping. But evidence is one thing, acknowledgement is another. To this day, there is no comprehensive accounting of who was held, how many died, what crimes were committed in the name of victory and security. The Russian government maintains some records remain too sensitive to release, that opening certain files would damage relations with neighboring countries, that some truths are better left buried. And perhaps that's the final cruelty, not just that these people suffered, not just that they died in terrible conditions, but that their suffering was deemed politically inconvenient, historically problematic, better erased than explained. These are the Russian ghosts of war, the men and women who survived battles only to be destroyed by the peace, who liberated themselves only to find they'd entered a different kind of prison, who carried stories that no one wanted to hear. They haunt the abandoned camps, the overgrown mass graves, the archives where their names are redacted or lost. They haunt the conscience of nations that chose forgetting over justice. And they ask us a question that echoes across the decades, across the frozen distances between what happened and what we choose to remember. If truth can be buried this completely, if suffering this vast can be minimized, forgotten, denied, what other histories lie beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to dig? What other ghosts are still waiting to tell their stories, to have their names spoken again, to be remembered, not as numbers, not as statistics, but as human beings who deserve better than the silence that swallowed them? The camps are gone now, most of them, torn down or reclaimed by forest, by taiga, by the relentless Siberian winter. But the questions remain. And until we answer them, until we acknowledge what was done and why it was hidden, the ghosts will keep whispering in the wind that crosses 11 time zones, in the archives that still hold secrets, in the places where history went to die, but refuses, even now, to stay buried.